So, what does the concept of brand mean to you? It's such an often used word, but it's got a pretty deep set of meanings. And one thing that's always interesting to me is how the concept of a brand evolves over the course of your career if you happen to work in these types of fields, which is why it's been really exciting for me to have the chance to talk to an old friend, an old colleague, Howard Handler. And I'm excited to share this conversation with you today. We talk about the incredible arc of his career and what it meant to go from working with a Quaker Oats company to suddenly working with Lorne Michaels and marketing Saturday Night Live and all the properties of Broadway Video and a million things after that, including Virgin Mobile, where I met him, and on to working at an incredible entertainment company in Detroit today. But there's a lot of lessons he has to share. And one of the central ones, as he put it, is relationships are everything. They are treasures. And you're going to hear that come through really strongly in this conversation. So sit back and listen. And if you enjoy what you're here, share it with another friend. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Anne Green, CEO at GNS Business Communications. And my guest and I first met back in 2003 when he joined my then client, Virgin Mobile USA, not long after its launch. And I have to say, I was a bit obsessed with his resume at the time. He was coming from senior brand and marketing roles at major players like Broadway Video. That's Lorne Michaels' company, for those who don't know, Viacom and NFL. And it kind of made me nervous to meet him, admittedly. But that immediately fell away. He's laughing already. As soon as I experienced his warmth and his energy and his infectious positive spirit. The client agency relationship can be tense at times, but he treats everyone like a core member of the team and like family. So he went on to lead other marketing roles at illustrious brands like EMI and MSG and Major League Soccer. That's the last time we saw each other in person, was when you were at MLS. And then in 2019, he returned to his native Michigan to take the president role at 313 Presents, which is Detroit's premier live entertainment company, overseeing 6 venues from the Fox Theater, Comerica Park, Little Caesars Arena, Pine Knob, and more. And then if you think about that timing, he immediately had to manage through that little thing you may recall called the pandemic. Remember that, everybody. And happily, though, now 2024 seems like it's been a hell of a year for 313, from helping to plan and host portions of the NFL draft to staging like a mind-boggling array of shows of all kinds. So Howard Handler, it's excellent to welcome you, my friend.
I am so psyched to be together with you.
I know it's been a while. It's been a while. So what's it like hearing that career arc? When you think about the arc of your career, it's a big question. What comes to mind in terms of kind of where it started from where it is today?
Well, it's always easier to connect the dots looking backwards. I never had any notion of how I would get from point A to point B. For me, it was always kind of 3 to 5 year horizons. I guess that's what I was able to think about. But I'm really proud of what I've accomplished, and mostly it's been about fun and building things and working with great people.
So before, and I like that idea, I'll come back to that 3 to 5 year, because it's so hard in this world today to even think about planning farther than that. This world is so crazy all the time. But before we get into more about your world, for those that aren't as familiar with 313, just tell them a little bit about your gig today, because it's such an exciting one, I feel like.
Well, 313 is an integrated venue promoter with a pretty large footprint. Our mission is to provide access to amazing entertainment and live moments inspired by the soul of Detroit. So we're here to tickle people's funny bone and pleasure spot and send some good vibes into the world. It is amazing, especially post COVID, turning around and looking at what happens to an audience as well as looking at what's happening on a stage. And it's just really fun to be in the business of entertaining people. Our 6 venues exist in downtown Detroit and around southeastern Michigan. Um, a good part of what we do represents an economic engine to the city of Detroit. And that's really important because Detroit is a Renaissance city. And it was a big part of the reason why I came home is I wanted to dive in and be a part of this rebirth and renewal. It's been really exciting. But yeah, it's a little bit of a flavor.
Yeah, it was interesting, knowing you as I did from the East Coast when we were working with Virgin Mobile and you were mostly on the East Coast in all of those jobs. It was kind of amazing to notice that you'd gone back to Michigan. And I've told Howard this before, but I was born in Toledo, Ohio, and that's where most of my mom's family's from. So I'm there quite often and just down Interstate 75 from Detroit. And so Detroit has always been big in my imagination, Toledo being a much smaller city. So I definitely want to get into. We're going to talk a little bit about other parts of your career, but I'm going to circle back because Detroit. There's a lot to talk about there, especially with what you guys have been up to, and a lot to think about relative to it being its own brand in a way. But how did you even embark on the sort of marketing field? You went after undergrad, went and got your MBA. What inspired you to do that, and what kind of got you kicked off in the beginning?
Well, I studied economics and history as an undergrad, and when it came time to think about what came next, what was going to come next in the midst of my senior year, I was honestly a bit terrified at the prospect of, entering the real world. And I wanted to be in school for a little bit longer and try to figure things out. So I kind of talked my way into business school. I was first rejected. Well, I was rejected by Northwestern, Dartmouth, as well as Michigan. Um, and, even back in those times, they wanted people to get into the working world before they came back to get an MBA. But I told this story about how I wanted to get an MBA because I wanted to be in the food business, and that was going to really help elevate my thinking and teach some skills, and they bought it. Now, I did legitimately have a great interest in the food business, and that would be the first job that I took out of business school. Working for the Quaker Oats Company, which laid an incredible foundation. But I think more broadly, marketing and the path that I chose was based on growing up in front of the television, listening to every single band that I could get exposed to, going to live concerts, and just really loving, music and pop culture and comedy. And I just never had any notion growing up in Detroit in the 60s and 70s that people could actually have jobs that somehow related to those things. There was nobody in show business in Detroit. I mean, there were probably a few, but for the most part, that just kind of seemed like this other world. And you know, I'm obviously dating myself even by saying the 60s and 70s, but it's like, the world was a lot flatter and smaller back in those days. We didn't have access to the internet and every single bit of information or knowledge at our fingertips. And so you had to learn things by talking to other people and doing research and letting your world unfold, as opposed to everything was possible all at once.
Yeah, it's funny what you're saying that because the time period you're talking about, Motown hadn't become quite the machine it became later, and where suddenly entertainment was there in the Motor City too, in that same way. But you're reminding me too about the fact that there's so much, when I go back to my alma mater and talk about marketing, branding, advertising, comms, right? And that is more of a liberal arts institution. There's so many aspects of the careers that you and I have had that's kind of invisible. Like sometimes culture will pop up, like Mad Men will become a thing, or Samantha on Sex and the City. It's like, oh, PR, right? But it's interesting, like your sense of now looking back to say, what were those aspects of culture that got you excited about, wow, could I be in that world? But I love also this story about the rejections, because I feel like when you're doing the college thing or graduate school or first job, everything seems so important. And then the farther you get in your career, the more everyone's like, doesn't even know where you went to school or what happened. So I think it's really cool to talk about the rejections and also the story you told to say, I belong here, It's really interesting. So you talked about Pepsi. And as I said, when I first met you, I was kind of glamored by Broadway Video, SNL, and all these other pieces that got my attention when I saw or heard about your resume, because this was pre LinkedIn as well. But you did start really in that classic consumer packaged goods brand manager space, which is work I've done in my past too. What were the lessons you took away there? Like that must have been such a crash course in the most classic forms of marketing.
It was definitely boot camp, as a marketer, as a general manager. It was just an absolute blast. I actually did an internship at the Quaker Oats Company in Chicago in between my first year and second year of business school. And it's funny, we talked about rejection. I went to New York. I had a girlfriend there at the time. I thought, like, I'm going to go to work for General Foods or Pepsi, which did not own the Quaker Oats Company until, much later. Um, and I had every door slammed in my face, so many no's. And it was funny because I bumped into my uncle, who's from Chicago, in New York on Central Park South. It was so crazy. And he was like, well, why don't you look in Chicago? And did a little research and, checked out the Quaker Oats Company. And that just seemed really interesting to me, because they had some terrific brands, and they had 3 internships. And I talked to somebody that went to the University of Michigan, and he told me the person to talk to. And at first the person was like, well, it's nice to talk to you, but we're not taking any of our interns from the University of Michigan. And, so I talked my way into that situation. But, I ended up obviously going back there full time after I was done with business school. I felt like I learned everything about running a consumer business. I learned about all the different P's of, pricing and promotion. And I learned about, distribution, place. I learned how to work with advertising agencies and create ads and measuring business and our sales. And importantly, I learned how to think about the entire P&L. That was one of the coolest things about brand management, is that they gave you a ton of responsibility at an early age. You worked in teams, so there were training wheels for sure, and there were layers of management to kind of protect things. But it's like by the time I was 28 years old, I was running a $70 million business. And yeah, it's kind of mind blowing, but you're working with other people who, were really hungry and really ambitious and, went to good schools. And so there was a kind of a natural competition. The bar was really high. I remember, the first time I got exposed to people who didn't make the cut, who got fired. So it was, reasonably stressful. But it was a blast. I mean, we were all kind of the same life stage. We're working with like Captain Crunch and Kibbles and Bits and, Life cereal and granola bars and all this stuff. And for us, that was a connection to pop culture. I got to travel around and start to see the rest of the country, and it was just amazing how steep the learning curve was, and just what I was able to understand. But what's interesting is I felt like a lot of those lessons dawned on me later in my career. That you look back on your foundation, and you keep taking things from it, and that was also very valuable.
Yeah, the hindsight is 2020 thing is real. These cliches are real for a reason. But it's interesting, like twice already you talked about where you've had to kind of talk yourself into something, not yourself, but other people. You're literally talking yourself into a space, which reminds me of storytelling. It's like, how do people create their own narrative about what's important? And it's also a form of advertising and marketing. Where did you get that skill? I mean, I know you, and you are incredible the way you can talk with people and connect with people and make really human connection with them. But what are some aspects that you've seen in yourself that you were able to sell yourself at those critical moments to kind of open doors that were closed at the time?
I guess for me, and again, like you gain self awareness as you get a little bit older. But I feel like I led with passion and enthusiasm and my energy. I really just tried hard to be as persuasive as possible. My dad, one of the great heroic figures in my life, uh, was a lawyer, and so breaking down an argument, being logical, being thoughtful, being a good communicator, I think are things that hopefully I've taken from him. My dad just turned 90 in June. It's pretty amazing. But I do think that if you really want something, you figure out a way to sell and be persuasive. And it doesn't always work, so getting a door slammed in your face doesn't feel good, but there's something to learn from that. And do you have a certain amount of tenacity? Are you willing to be persistent? And I don't know. I think a lot of those things helped me, um, you know, get to where I needed to be. I don't feel like I had like an imposter syndrome. Um, but I always did fancy myself as a little bit of an overachiever. I grew up with some people, and it's like one of those funny old things. But it's like I remember a couple of my friends didn't have to study so hard or at all, and they could just get A's. And I knew that I was the type of person that I had to do my homework. I had to work really hard, and I was never ashamed of that. I was like, I will outwork you. So that persistence and tenacity and work ethic were probably part of it as well.
So powerful. You remind me with the enthusiasm, speaking of culture, Lin Manuel Miranda, obviously a brilliant Broadway guy. He jokes about having no chill, that he was like just so enthusiastic about stuff. And that always struck me because I'm certainly a bit like that too, where it's like I'm just really into things, very enthusiastic, always want to do more. And I felt that from you in terms of just that, like I talked about that infectious energy and the ability, they talk in business about followership, about getting people to follow you. And do you feel like that kind of enthusiasm, optimism, or engagement helps in that?
I mean, it can be infectious for sure. If you are a manager, you have to motivate other people. And so, you know, the, again, it comes back to some form of selling, but getting people to believe. Um, and I don't know. I mean, it was something that my late father-in-law used to, kind of tease me about a little bit. He said one time, because it's like I'm, the brand manager for Quaker Chewy granola bars and Life cereal, and those were like the most important thing. And then it's about Saturday Night Live, and it's the Church Lady and Hans and Franz and Wayne's World. And he said, man, he said, you know, if you were the president of the PTL network, um, for those that need the historical background, that's the Praise the Lord network. He's like, I could sell that, which I took as a bit of a backhanded compliment. So that was okay. But yeah, I mean, you gotta believe.
When my dad worked for Nabisco, I was kind of told the Keebler elves were the devil. So you got to love the brand that you're with, right? I mean, speaking, you got to ride for your brands. Um, Speaking of SNL, and you were working with Lauren in Broadway Video at a time where what a legendary era. I mean, Mike Myers, Dana Carvey, Chris Farley, the beautiful Phil Hartman, Adam Sandler. I mean, it just goes. Tim Meadows. It goes on and on with and Wayne's World about to come out. I think right around the time you were moving on. But was that such a hard left turn from consumer packaged goods? Like, was that? How did you end up there? And was that a little bit like, wow, I have to reset my brain in this completely different environment?
Well, it was a pretty big change. Um, I guess I did really and truly love being at the Quaker Oats Company and being this consumer marketing guy. But along the way, my world, my network started to expand, and I actually did meet people who were in the entertainment business and created some pretty deep relationships. And one of those people, a guy named Eric Ellenbogen, was like, "You must be in show business." And I was like, "Yeah." I set this goal for myself. He wanted me to go right away, just skip Quaker and go right into the entertainment business. And I was like, I set this goal for myself. I really want to be a brand manager. That's going to take me a few years. I want to get as much as I can out of this experience. I was committed to going to Chicago. Kid from Detroit, Chicago's the big city. Really, really fun, vibrant city. I got to Chicago um, in the fall of '85. Okay. The Bears won the Super Bowl, in January of '86. I mean, that was a pretty exciting time to be in Chicago, but the Bears. And I would have a full circle experience at SNL with Bill Swirsky super fans, the Bills, the Bulls, the Bears. But Eric ultimately was somebody that I built a relationship with over time. He would go from being a Hollywood producer to being the head of Broadway Video. And so there was a time when he said, "Okay, I got the job for you. You're going to be the VP of marketing at Broadway Video." And I was a brand manager at that point. I did not really get too excited about the additional, layers and steps on the ladder. at a big company like the Quaker Oats Company. And I was like, wow, Broadway Video. This is Lorne Michaels, little independent production company. Eric and Lorne had assembled this really core crew of really talented people, and they would all go on to do some pretty incredible things. I had absolutely no idea what the VP of marketing for Broadway Video would be responsible for, but I was like, I'm game. Let's take the plunge. My wife Wendy and I were at that stage of life where we're like, hey, why not? Let's take our shot. We didn't have kids. We didn't have much of a mortgage. It didn't seem like there was any downside. And so we picked up and moved to New York. And, it was like dragging a desk into an empty office. Eric had some aspirations, and Lorne articulated a bit of what he was willing to explore. And I was able to dive in and build a merchandising business, do publishing, home video, for anybody that remembers VHS tapes. That was my introduction to show business. And it was, Life Cereal one day and Toonces, the driving cat, and, Hans and Franz the next day. What's interesting is that nobody cared about an MBA or where I went to school or the Quaker Oats Company. It was actually when I started to meet the cast and the writers, I knew just instinctively that they could have cared less about any of that. And so it was a big, hard turn. And I did have to be a really good chameleon and adjust and pick up the cues. And it's like, how do they speak to each other? What are they interested in? I had to do a little bit of my own diagnostic thing to understand, what would be success? What was Eric looking for? And ultimately, my relationship became more direct with Lorne. And as anybody who's ever worked around SNL would know, he's the guy. He's making any and all big decisions. He's in charge of the brand. It's his sensibility. And I had to figure that out. And it wasn't easy. I definitely, ran into the wall a couple of times, but I felt like I was in an environment where, I could learn. And if I accomplished some things along the way, they'd let me stick around.
And I feel like that was a time, if people think back, folks of different ages have to remember this is before YouTube existed. There was no Lazy Sunday, with Andy Samberg and those guys kind of changed the nature of SNL. Wasn't so ubiquitous. There was no social media. But I feel like you guys were doing some of the first omni-channel stuff where you were breaking it out into different places. I was also obsessed with Kids in the Hall, which is something that Lorne helped with a great deal. But one of the things that really struck me, Howard, it reminds me of something you talked about your dad. My dad used to say to me when I was growing up, don't travel too light. And he meant people. He meant don't be so quick to leave people behind, stay connected. One of my mentors, Ralph Katz, is one of the most brilliant people ever. He keeps people with him all the time. But it feels like in that relationship with Eric, you maybe ascribe to the same thing. Because I feel like that even the way you and I are catching up and talking about, this person, that person, how does that phrase strike you, not traveling too light, when it comes to people in your career?
I love that expression. For me, and I share this with my wife, Wendy, as well, is relationships are everything. They are treasures. And those treasures are collected and nurtured. And, if you're lucky, they can, grow and become more valuable over time. And I've been really, really lucky in terms of the people who were willing to mentor me and help me see things that at the time I couldn't see for myself, or, teach me some things. And it's just funny, over time, at a certain point, it kind of flipped, and then I became that person. And so the people part, the people part has been critical. And Lorne Michaels is an incredibly quotable person, but one of the first things was like, it's all about relationships. Um, and he was right. He was right. And it's funny because when I met Adam Sandler, nobody knew who he was. I mean, he had obviously been a successful comic and showed, quite a bit of promise. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made it to 30 Rock. But he was a more junior member of the cast, and was, really hustling to kind of get into sketches and to start to make a name for himself. Um, he came and played Little Caesars Arena, 2 years ago, and got to spend some time with him, and we got to have some laughs that you know we're not those kind of young upstarts anymore. But it's those relationships that you form early in life, early in your career, can and should be valuable to you, much later in life. And, think about the two of us. We just kind of pick up where we left off.
Which is I love that relationships are everything, they're a treasure. By the way, I was secretly hoping maybe a Lorne Michaels impression would pop out. So it's just a natural thing that happens. When you think about, I mean, this is great. And after that, there was Viacom and NFL, which is what you did right before I met you. And those are huge brands too. But I want to bring us up to the Virgin Mobile era, mostly because, this podcast is called Building Brand Gravity, all about the idea of what brings you into the gravity, into the orbit, like what pulls at you. And when you think about iconic brands and branding, Virgin is it's just massive in that way. Now, I don't know how people relate to it who are much younger generations, and it's different if you're in England or in Britain versus the US, but in the time that we were working together, it's just such a juggernaut. And Richard's still out there doing his thing, Richard Branson. I shouldn't have to say that for anyone but Sir Richard Branson. But what was it like for you joining a Virgin brand that was just at that moment launching, like it was a new cell phone company launching in the US for the first time? So the Virgin name was on it, but it was a new brand, new model, new technology, lots of headwinds, but there was the Virgin name on it. What did that mean to you coming into that ecosystem?
Well, I was a fanboy. Richard Branson was this heroic, aspirational figure for me because, fundamentally, he was a disruptor. I don't think anybody used those words, used a word like that back then. I think that's a little bit more of an internet age, reference. But this was a guy who shook things up and found opportunity. And I remember the first time I went into a Virgin Megastore. I had never flown on Virgin Atlantic, but I kind of heard about it and knew a little bit. So I was like, wow, I can't believe that I'm going to get to represent and actually build a Virgin brand in the US. What's really interesting, and I think that, it's easy to forget, is that in the early 2000s, Virgin was not a well-known brand in the United States. Record labels, the brands of record labels, don't necessarily mean so much unless you're a real music nerd. The Motown label, that was a little bit different. So Virgin Records certainly had a legacy, but it wasn't what I would call a consumer brand that had a promise and a reason for being. And, it was about the Rolling Stones and Lenny Kravitz and, the Sex Pistols and, Um, you had the Virgin Megastores, but there weren't a lot of those. There were a handful of those in really big cities. So like, Urbane, kind of big city people might have heard of Virgin. And, Virgin Atlantic, I mean, I hate to say it, but, there's not a high percentage of people in the United States that even have a passport, much less, travel. Now, it's probably a little bit more mainstream to travel internationally today. But again, back then, the idea of traveling to London was pretty exotic. So you had a small percentage of the population that had some awareness of the Virgin brand. And with Virgin Mobile, we were trying to create a wide, almost mass consumer phenomenon with the cell phone, which didn't really have much penetration. We were trying to create, as the Brits would say, a fast moving consumer product with a mobile phone. Up to that point, mobile phones were behind a glass case. You had to sign up for a contract. And, Richard's idea and the idea of Virgin Mobile that had gotten started a little bit earlier in the UK and also in Singapore was, we want this to be a very familiar consumer product that's easily accessible and that has a bit of a younger sensibility and actually will be targeted towards young people because they should have cell phones. Cell phones will liberate and allow for independence and everything else like that. So we really had, I guess, the building blocks of a cool brand, but it was really up to us to define it and to propagate it and to build awareness. And so the idea that we were going to create truly a national brand for Virgin was like overwhelmingly cool and fun. I mean, I was pinching myself the whole time. I remember the first time I met Richard. I remember, flying on Virgin Atlantic, which I felt was truly the embodiment of everything that he imagined, brand experience and everything else like that. But we had the keys to the kingdom, he gave, he gave a bunch of Americans, a lot of responsibility. Let's just say that.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about that time and what was built and what the market was like at that time and those lessons that you took away. I wanted to shift back to your current role where you're president now, you're leading an organization. Has it been, and you've done that more than once in your career, but what prepared you from your earlier experiences to then take sort of the leadership role overall? Would you feel like there was a good, all of those different marketing experiences, as you said, even back at Quaker Oats, knowing the whole P&L and the whole deal, do you feel like that prepared you well over time to take the helm at the top?
Yeah, I do think it was, in some ways a little bit back to the future. In brand management, you are taught to think about the whole business and that you're not there to just deliver one thing like sales revenue or market share. You're there to deliver the profit. And that's something that never really left me. It's really interesting because there's lots of different accountability that marketing leaders can have. Some marketing leaders are, purely about Marcom. And so the metrics that they might be responsible for, relate to that, that set of that part of the mix. I was always a little bit more of a line marketer where I had revenue and in some cases profit. So when I was at the NFL, I oversaw marketing, but I also had the publishing business and I had we called it direct commerce because at first it was catalogs, and then it was this thing called e-commerce, and we built the NFL shop, which has turned into this ginormous business, like all things NFL. And I had a publishing business, and and those were actual, revenue, cost, profit. I had to be accountable for that. When I was at Virgin, I had sales and product, and so I had different pieces of the P&L. And Dan Schulman, the CEO, good friend of both of ours, would go on to be the CEO of PayPal. He felt as CEO that his role was certainly to lead the company, but he placed a very high priority in terms of giving us context and making sure that we could see how all the pieces connected together. So, yeah, I was chief marketing officer, and there was the COO, and there was the head of technology, and there was a CFO. But as a leadership team, we were always focused on the P&L. And it was all about, like, okay, what part were you responsible for? What were you contributing to? How would you complement and help the other people that were delivering the whole thing? And so Dan, as a CEO, was truly like a band leader, and we were all there to make music, but we could all see what he was doing. And so for me to become president of 313 Presents, first of all, it was my goal to get back to running a whole business. I loved being a CMO, but I was kind of hungry to own the whole business and the P&L. And so it was kind of a natural transition. And again, it's like, it isn't a difficult transition from being a line marketer that has to deliver real metrics to being a president or a CEO that has to worry about the whole P&L.
And those are good lessons, though, as people shape their career. What do you understand your accountability to be? Even if you're not given the P&L, how do you make those connections and feel that responsibility for it? I'd interviewed another person for this podcast series who talked about chief communications folks need to see that their business is the business of the business and revenue. So I love that connection. As we start to wind down, because you've been so generous with your time, Howard, what do you think about brand Detroit? Detroit just has an outside, I think, role in a lot of people's imagination. And sometimes in recent decades, that's been really hard. Like, Detroit has had to take so much negative baggage, more than it deserved, I feel like. And now it's been really energizing for me, and I know so many other people, and I don't even live there, to see that sort of energy, as you said, a Renaissance city. But how do you think about Detroit as a brand, and where's that brand today?
Well, Detroit is a legendary brand, and anybody that's born here or out of town and from here is shaped by a bunch of powerful things. Detroit gave the United States, for sure, and some would argue the world, the car. And the car was about, freedom and discovery and exploration. Detroit gave the world Motown, and house music and punk and like all kinds of things. And so, living out of town, living in New York in particular for 30 years, it never left me in terms of, what made me and where I was from. And, wherever I traveled in the US or North America or the world, it's like, where are you from? You're from Detroit. And people would always be like, oh, wow, Detroit. And they would talk about, oh, I'm a car guy, or, oh my God, Marvin Gaye, or Iggy Pop, or, and so it's like, yeah, that was a foundation. And, this was also the place where people could get union jobs and make a living, and you know, but it all came crashing down. And so, you know, part of the legacy and what we've had to deal with was the decline, um, you know, the bankruptcy, and you know, there's some hard times, and you know, for a while people were caught up in the political dysfunction, urban decay. Um, the bankruptcy was really, you know, the low point. But what was striking to me, and one of the reasons why it was so exciting for me to come home, was there were a lot of people that were not willing to let this city go, and and people like Mike Ilitch in the early days, and later on Dan Gilbert, the Ford family, Steve Ross, you know, Tom Gores, a bunch of people said, "Wait a second, this is one of the greatest cities in America." Um, and we believe in it. We want to build it back. And so, you know, these last, you know, decade and a half has been this incredible renaissance. And you have these kind of touchstone experiences that have and moments that have happened. Um, you know, I was here for the NFL draft, and that made people look at Detroit and go, "Whoa, look at, you know, this, yeah, look at the city. The city's on its way back." And then, you know, most recently, the reopening of Michigan Central, um, and you know, the care and the passion and the commitment that, you know, the Ford family put into bringing this thing back. And this is what's really fun, is that kind of people lean in together and are trying to reestablish the legacy of innovation, great design, music, and you know, and catapult it into the future.
What an awesome time for you to come back, despite the pandemic, which I know was not easy. But here you are now, just having just an incredible, you know, if people go to 313 Presents website, if you're in the area, you see just an incredible array of stuff going on. Last question, Howard. What brands or parts of culture have you in their gravity right now? Anything cool that you've been paying attention to recently?
There's a really cool Japanese outdoor brand called Snow Peak. I'm kind of like an outdoor wilderness athletic type. Um, Incredible design, super cool. Um, a niche and growing clothing brand that I love, Mad Happy. Um, just did this capsule collection with the Gap that people are freaking out over. Um, you know, the Olympics as a brand is back. Paris as a brand is back. Kamala as a brand is revitalized. I don't know. I'm a brand junkie, so I'm always kind of thinking about all this stuff. The cool thing about what I get to do with 313 Presents, I mean, we do about 350 shows a year across our various 6 venues, and we're starting to branch out. Is all these artists are brands with distinct audiences, and it's just fascinating, you know, every single night who's coming to see what artist, and it's amazing to see an artist, you know, really build their audience, and to go from one of our smaller amphitheaters to maybe the Fox Theater to Little Caesars Arena to Comerica Park. You know, it's like I've already seen Chris Stapleton go from, you know, Pine Knob to headlining his own show at Comerica Park. It's a blast. So I'll forever be, you know, passionate about brands.
I love it. Well, Howard Handler, thank you so much for your time today. This was an awesome conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anne. Loved being a part of this.